Google Hangout. This is Sequart. Welcome to our Patreon exclusive Google Hangout. I'm Julian Darius, and I'll be your host today. And with us is Richard Bensam, who edited our book Minutes to Midnight, 12 Essays on Watchmen. And two of the contributors to that book are also here with us. They are Walter Hudzik and Jeff Clock. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay, so this was our book on Watchmen, and Richard, you edited the book. You had previously contributed to Teenagers from the Future on the Legion of Superheroes, right?
Right.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about putting the book together. Just before the show, we were reminiscing about our days in New York at the New York Comic Con, where a lot of these early books came together, actually.
Yes, well, there's actually a secret origin to my involvement with Watchmen, and I'm not sure if even you know about this, Julian. Now, I had done that one essay for the Legion of Superheroes book, and I wanted to do more for Sequart, and we were throwing ideas around, and you did mention that you were interested in doing a Watchmen book, and I jumped on that. I think I might have feigned hesitation. I might have tried to conceal my enthusiasm. But I jumped on it, and what you may not have known at the time, or I'm sure you didn't know it at the time, and I may not have mentioned it since then, is that at the UK Comic Art Convention in September 1985, I was the moderator of the very first panel that was ever conducted at a convention about Watchmen, before the first issue came out. So I was the moderator, and we had Moore was there, and Dave Gibbons, and John Higgins. And it was even recorded by DC Comics. They had a film crew there in case they wanted to use it for future publicity purposes, which I don't think came about. But so I knew as little as anyone did, managed to fake my way through it. And when you have Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons on a panel, you really don't need to do any work at all. So,
well, this was back when Alan was still going to cons.
Oh yeah, he was a regular there, and he is a much more approachable person, I think, than people realize from the reputation he has today. And if you think about the amount of unwanted attention he does get, and I was actually attending these conventions in London, I did see that evolution take place when it went from the point where he was an active participant in conventions and he was quite happy to be around fans and interact with them. As a matter of fact, I had a great conversation with him about the Legion when I met him before that panel. He's a big fan. And then it would get to the point where he could not go to the men's room without being harassed by people who wanted him to give some great spiritual insight or complain to him about something in Swamp Thing. And he had to withdraw from that whole scene.
Yeah, in those days, were the men's rooms a swamp at these conventions, or were they still relatively small?
This was held at a student union building at the University of London. And
so very civilized.
Yeah, it was. It had a bar, and it had a snack bar as well, and a very much more relaxed kind of atmosphere, I think, compared to the way American conventions were at the time. But,
well, I do remember hearing the story about you moderating that panel, and you know, it occurs to me to ask, maybe you could talk about how Watchmen was perceived at its time. You know, there are sort of anecdotes about comics readers picking up the newest issue and sharing them around the office and sort of being aware that this was a big deal and that this was kind of pushing comics forward.
Absolutely. I don't think people appreciated at the time that that it was going to last this long, certainly, but it was the main topic of conversation every time a new issue came out. That panel, that initial panel, when no one had any reason to think that it was anything of interest beyond just being a new mini-series, that panel was already packed because, Alan was already a superstar, and it was perceived that way on both sides of the Atlantic. At the time that this was coming out, at the time the series was coming out, I was actually working at Marvel Comics, and when a new issue came out, that's all everyone at Marvel was talking about. People who worked in Romita's bullpen, John Romita's bullpen, the actual art correction department, they'd be passing around the issues and speculating, who was Hooded Justice? What was his connection to Rorschach? What's going on here? And so this was, it was an overnight sensation, it really was.
Well, that's very much what I've read too. So maybe you could talk about briefly about sort of putting the book together, and I know you spent an awful lot of time coming up with perspective chapters and sort of balancing the whole thing out. It was very impressive.
Well, no, actually, what I remember about that was when you and Mike Phillips mentioned it to me. We were just batting around ideas. I think right that first day, when you first mentioned it, we came up with enough ideas for potential essays to fill 3 books. And there were certain ones that I knew we had to get in there, and I was already making a mental list up of who I wanted to ask and who did I want to bring in from my own acquaintance, and Walter was definitely one, and who were bloggers that I knew had writing ability and the potential interest, and Jeff was definitely in that category. But we came up with so many ideas right there. I don't know. I would say at least half the stuff that's in the book were concepts that we had already batted around that first day. And then other things came along that were a complete surprise to me because I threw it open to potential contributors. I think, as I recall, I sent out a long list of potential ideas that people could jump on if they appealed to them. And Walter definitely picked the one I was secretly hoping.
Well, that's very much what I remember about sort of batting ideas around at the Sequart booth at the New York Comic Con. That was probably maybe the second New York Comic Con, if I recall correctly. And you were, a great help to us, and really helped us at the table, and we're still figuring out what the hell we were doing back then, and only had a few books out, and you were a fantastic help, and it was fun sitting there, especially in between convincing passersby, hey, comics matter, and you should take this organization seriously, having these grand arching discussions about Watchmen.
Yeah, that's how I remember it.
Okay, so let me shift to Walter here, Walter Hudzik. Richard mentioned that you chose the subject that he wanted you to choose, and the title of your essay is "Reassembling the Components in the Correct Sequence: Why You Shouldn't Read Watchmen First." So,
Right.
Why shouldn't somebody read Watchmen first, and what do you remember about that creative process there?
Well, what I remember first is I think my original title was something like "Don't Read Watchmen." And being a very good editor, Richard said maybe that's not the direction we want to go with this book. But it's funny. I feel a little bit distant here. This is the first time in a long time out here in Seattle that I felt like I'm in a Here Come the Brides episode, because y'all are, back in the East Coast with the big cons and all that stuff. And my connection, is less intense than yours, and I'm a community college teacher, so a lot of the people I deal with are much younger than I am. And I use comics and graphic novels in the classroom quite often when I teach writing from research or even just basic composition. In research writing, we use Bradford Wright's Comic Book Nation as a model text, and we use excerpts from Sequart books and some of the other collections that come out as model essays of analysis. And I'm always focused on comics because that's one of the nice things about an English teacher. You get to teach what it is that you're interested in because you have to write about something. And I find that a lot of the students that I work with who are, 21 and younger, it's sad from my perspective, but they're not nearly as connected to comics as any of us, I'm sure, were in our teens or even in our young adult years. It's just not the conventional medium anymore. They know superheroes, perhaps, from the movies and now from television, but there are very few comic readers. In a typical class of 24 or 30 people, I'll get 1 or 2 who are regular comics readers. So I've spent a lot of my time, when we're using these texts, kind of filling in the background of what comics are and how they came to be and what they are as a social construct as well as a form and things like that. So the essay that I contributed to the Minutes to Midnight was really the opportunity to put in formal form an argument that I'd been making or an explication that I'd been making both to my students and to my younger friends for a long time. When you have people who got into reading comics, if they did at all, only after the late 80s or the 90s, trying to actually assess the impact of Watchmen in its context is really, really hard. And trying to appreciate the sort of commentary on the form itself that's eminent in the Watchmen, as well as its plot and its all the wonderful technique that it demonstrates and all the other things. But just trying to get how much layered meaning was in there for someone who already had the history, that was something that I was very interested in. I'd already done it, over beers with my buddies a number of times, and this was a chance to pull it all together under some great editorship and actually create a permanent document for it.
Now, I remember your essay talked a lot about the Charlton heroes and the sort of reliance upon that as a template for mixing it up and creating this kind of revisionist take, not only on those heroes, but also on sort of the whole history of superheroes and comics, which is something that's so self-conscious in Watchmen. Maybe you could say something about the role of those Charlton heroes.
Yeah, and that's the layered meaning I'm talking about. When DC got the ownership of those properties, I think more saw it as an opportunity to, in a very concrete way, deconstruct the superheroes by actually using not just made-up ones, but properties that had been around for a while that people recognized and that people may even have had some connections to. I mean, I knew Charlton was always, I was a DC guy for, most of my life, but Charlton had some groovy stuff going on, and I liked some of the art, and they had Ditko showing up once in a while, and so I knew those people, and I know I would have responded even more viscerally to Watchmen when it came out if it actually had been the Charlton heroes, because that was who I had grown up with. So I think this was when he was denied that privilege because they had plans for those properties. I think this was, the next best step towards trying to do that. But again, if you didn't have any knowledge of those characters at all, even if you could get, oh, he's disassembling comics in some way, there's not that real emotional connection to it that brings it up to the next level of understanding for you. That, oh, this was somebody I thought was cool, and now I realize a different dimension of that character that I had never considered before, or a different way that actually would have worked out. So there's all those layers behind it of understanding that pile up. And if you had them, it was a jewel. If you didn't have them, it's great, but there's pieces missing, both in the intellectual and mostly in the emotional experience. God, I do sound like I teach college, don't I?
I think many of us sound that way in one way or another.
I teach, like Walter. I mean, I also teach at a community college, so I've adopted the same. I don't know what your population over there is like, but I recognize myself in hearing you talk.
Oh, good, yeah, and our college in particular is mostly prep for 4 years, so we're much more like a traditional age college rather than a broad spectrum community college, which narrows it even more because we really skew to the young, and I hardly find anybody who can remember the stuff I remember.
Can I just cut in here that I barely finished high school? I am not a teacher or academic. I feel really out of place in the world.
No.
Didn't Orson Welles not finish high school either? I don't think Orson Welles ever had much formal education either, and yet they always hired him to like do documentaries on the Impressionists and all that kind of stuff. You know, it doesn't matter.
It really doesn't. It really doesn't. It really doesn't. In fact, I mean, I'm always yelling at people at school because they want to hire people that only have PhDs for these jobs. And I know so many smart people, and I'm like, can we give that guy a job? And they're like, well, no, he doesn't have a PhD. And I'm like, do you need a PhD to do this job? Like, this guy wrote a couple of books. Why don't you? He's wrote more books than I wrote. So why don't you get him to,
Well, and I think that my father was a professor, and I went on to get a PhD, and it is a not a glamorous profession that everyone imagines. And while you certainly learn a lot of things through that process, the number one thing you learn is to stick through the hazing and overcome just the minute level of editorial changes that you are absolutely powerless to, and lessons like this. That's not to say, I loved college, but I think that what you're saying, Richard, actually gets at one of the things that your book does so well, and that is perfectly in tune with Sequart's philosophy, which is that those in academia are always reading about and always hearing about how we need to reach out to a broader audience, and we don't want to be a sort of closeted community of just the ivory tower where we sit around and have these cerebral discussions, but nobody need apply if they don't have the right credentials. That's not how anyone really wants to live their life, especially if they loved ideas and literature enough to do such a obviously self-destructive thing as spending 7 years and getting a PhD. And on the flip side, in comics, and we'll get back to Watchmen in a second, but on the flip side, in comics you have such a vibrant fan community, and we all know about the history of the fanzines and some of the real scholarship, as well as interviews and just indexes and things like this that was done by the fan community, and that too often, even to this day, is not acknowledged by the Academy as it branches into comic studies. And so, one of the major things that was always on the agenda for Sequart was sort of to bridge this gap and sort of bring the fan and the academic together in a place where you could have serious intellectual discourse, which comic fans embrace pretty well, and which a lot of academics, embrace pretty well too, and are really sick of writing, the 10th essay littered with citations to people citing Foucault in order to, try to get tenure or promotion.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, go ahead, Richard.
All right,
okay,
I was just going to say, one of us will decide to go first. It'll be me. I'm the editor.
Yeah.
No, I vividly remember that when we were throwing around the initial ideas for potential essays, and there were some great ones that we didn't manage, but the one that that Walter wrote, that concept, that was one I was especially keen on because I am coming to Watchmen or writing about comics in general from that background in organized fandom of the early 70s and fanzines, and I felt like that was an ingredient that Sequart could use. And I knew from Walter's blogging that he was, like me, this old school Silver Age comics fan. He would come to it from that perspective. And so I really wanted to get that voice into it because, well, obviously it's a huge part of Watchmen, but it's, for me personally, that's my orientation towards reading comics, is knowing that history and background. And with Jeff, on the other hand, he came at it from a direction I had no clue was coming. I remember he was on my wish list of people. Oh, it'd be great if we could get him, but he'd never agree to this. No offense to Sequart, but it was not really.
That's how we felt too. I mean, he was. I remember having those conversations. Jeff, you're being embarrassed right now, but you didn't know. Richard and I were scheming.
We were just fans.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I remember. He actually answered back, which a lot of people didn't. I mean, I sent out a lot of query messages, and amazingly, Jeff answered back, and I was like, really? Really? We could have him? And he said, well, I think that Watchmen is interesting and good, but maybe not great, and are you okay with an essay that looks at it from a slightly more skeptical perspective? And I thought, well, yeah, but remember, people who hate Watchmen are not in our target audience. They're not likely to buy the book, so so let's see how that works out. And then Jeff did this amazing thing. So that was one of the pieces that, whereas Walter did exactly what I hoped for and envisioned, Jeff was one of the people who completely surprised me. It just came out of a direction I wasn't expecting. Julian, your essay was a direction I wasn't expecting at all. Bill Ritchie's essay on science and the philosophy and history of science as it's depicted in Watchmen, never saw that coming. So that was actually, for me, the best part of it was the surprises we got out of it.
Well, Jeff, since you're being talked about, let's bring you in here.
Thank you for all the
as we put laurels on you. So your essay was called "The End Is Nigh: The Limits of Watchmen," and so what was so surprising about that for Richard and everyone?
I mean, I think I was so. I wrote the book that I wrote, the How to Read Superhero Comics book, when I was like 21, and I was like, and I'm, I'm so invested in these things as like the most, the way you do when you're 20. This is the most important thing in human history. With no, and there's so much, like, it's like Rumsfeld and the unknown unknowns, right? There's so much that I don't know that I don't even know. But I'm convinced that these are like the truly great works of, when I think when you guys email me about that, like, I don't know, I feel like I was 26 or 27, and I had the PhD now, but I didn't have a job. And I was making that, I was adjuncting, so I'm like teaching these like one-off classes with like no health insurance, and no, promise of continual employment, and being hired like the day after classes start, just throw you in there and see if you can fly, and so like I was kind of struggling with my own with sort of transitioning into like proper adulthood, and I was reflecting on Watchmen from the position of being an adjunct college professor and being like, is this what adulthood is like? And was there something juvenile about my obsession with Watchmen? And was there something juvenile and limited? Because I was seeing people who were like making fun of the Nietzsche quotes, because who the hell uses Nietzsche epigraphs to a comic book except for like, trench coat angsty teenagers? And of course, that was exactly what I was doing when I was 16, was wearing a trench coat and quoting Nietzsche. so I was kind of using it as a chance to kind of reflect back on like how I was so obsessed with those books, and was there something juvenile in the obsession with it? Is Watchmen a teenager's an idea of what adulthood is like? This cynical, broken, lonely, and Randian, right? I mean, the Rorschach's character in particular, brings in Ditko's sort of Ayn Rand interest, and Ayn Rand is one of these sort of the great philosopher of every 16-year-old boy. And so I was kind of using it as so the thoughts on Watchmen, it comes from a very kind of autobiographical place where I'm thinking like, what did I do and why did I do that and how is my life going to be different now?
Well, and I think that your essay sort of dovetails with how to read superhero comics and why, in the sense that in that book, you were really embracing the kind of return to fun that was going on at the time. We're talking the end of the 90s and into the 2000s. And you talked about a lot of Wildstorm titles, and I mean, this was all in the wake of like Morrison's JLA and stuff like this. That it really was turning hard away from the kind of, one could say pretentious, serious. Some could also say literary. Sort of high literary aspirations that came with some of that 1980s agenda there that, really, I think you're right, it was fundamentally about a kind of insecurity. Comics should matter. How do we make them matter? Let's make them read like War and Peace with Nietzsche quotes or something. Yeah. And you were really discussing that in the context of Watchmen. And that connected to the book you had written.
Yeah, well, and it interests me like there's so many little like unconscious slippages between like because I want to say it the way you say it, right? We're like, oh, it's high literary as opposed to like, when did high literary come to mean like real serious all the time for vengeance? Is that like, it's funny how high literary got connected to like miserable, and there's that great line that really haunted me from Grant Morrison's Flex Mentallo, where it's this kind of self-conscious comment about seriousness in comics and the grim and gritty comics with realistic. Like it's only a teenage boy that would confuse pessimism and realism. Mm-hmm. And that really, and it still remains, Grant Morrison's line in that book still remains like one of the. Watchmen it's never going to be knocked down, but that's the hardest I've ever seen anybody punch it. Mm-hmm. And again, I love Watchmen. Let me be super clear about this. One of my points in the essay is that it's entirely possible to be the best at something and still be overrated. Like, nobody's saying Watchmen isn't the most amazing, incredible. But there's a funny thing that happens where we go super serious equals literary, and I'm thinking, have you read a lot of literature? Because it doesn't have to be miserable. And but of course, I'm also in my life struggling with am I a serious, important scholar, or do I need to chill out and go to a restaurant and have some fun and sit in the park for 20 minutes?
That's really interesting, Jeff, because part of my perspective in approaching it is, and maybe this is one of the things Richard noticed in my blogs, is that I kind of tend to label myself a formalist, where I'm often looking at how somebody did something, and less about specifically the content. Oh, I think this was important because it was gritty, or whatever it was. And I think that's a conflation that people are doing. They didn't look at it and say, oh, Watchmen is really great because the creators did some really interesting and creative and innovative things. It's, it had this theme, so therefore that's what I'm going to model because I want to be serious too, instead of I'm going to put just as much effort and energy and innovation into my work.
Well, and of course, because there's it's frankly, I think, easier to mimic serious themes than it is to have the kind of formal daring that you see in that book. It's a much, and we see this all the time where you look at oh boy, Michael Bay is going to remake Freddy Krueger, or a couple of years ago, right? He announces, and I'm thinking that's not a good idea. And then I'm watching an interview with him, and he says something Of course he does. He says something ridiculous like, right, well, we really want to like get into the Freddy Krueger character and like really think about it because of course it's not Freddy. I'm sorry, Freddy Krueger. I think I said Friday the 13th, but Freddy Krueger.
Yeah.
And he says, well, we're really gonna really get the Freddy Krueger character. And I'm sitting at home going, man, you don't get it. Like that's not about Freddy Krueger. Like Freddy Krueger's that's like saying the birds isn't really about the birds. It's about the people's reaction to the birds. Do you know, like Freddy Krueger, it's about teenagers and how sheltered they are and how their parents suburban white teenagers don't get their parents shielding them from the world. They think they're protecting them, but they're actually endangering them. That's the story. And if you think the story is Freddy Krueger, you missed it. Right? Like he's an excuse to talk about this actual human thing that affects everybody, not like a monster that chases you through your dreams. That's not what resonates with people. What resonates with people is the human aspect of it. And in the same way with Watchmen, it's like they emulate the wrong things. Like all the people that saw The Godfather and were like, yeah, Michael Corleone, let's do more of that. Like, no, that's not a character. He's saying don't emulate this guy. And people are like, what are you talking about? He's awesome. Scarface! Like, no. Well,
I mean,
you emulate the wrong things.
This gets us into the problem of how difficult it is to detach Watchmen from both its reputation and now, of course, Zack Snyder's adaptation. And I was thinking, as you were talking, Jeff, of how, of course, Marvel kind of has largely embraced these kind of fun superhero movies, and we're about to get a DC cinematic universe that's defined by, the palette of the Dark Knight films for no apparent reason.
Well, there is a reason. I mean, it's right. It's that they made $1 billion with Batman, and then they saw what Marvel was doing, and we need to make other people. I was very baffled as to why Man of Steel was so grumpy, and then I realized. And then when they announced the Batman-Superman crossover, I went, oh, that's why. Because they made $1 billion off Batman. It had a grumpy tone. And so everybody needs to be in that tone because that's the origin of the universe is grumpy Batman.
Yeah, but aren't we talking about the same thing, Jeff? I mean, the Batman movies didn't make $1 billion because they were grumpy. They made $1 million and they were grumpy.
Yes, but executives can't tell. Executives don't think like that because they're not artists. Right. They're like McDonald's. They're like, we got the burger and now we need another burger that looks just like that burger all over the planet. And that's they're execs. They're suits. That's what they do.
But I mean, are we putting too much weight on Watchmen? I mean, we almost can't not because it's been sort of held up rightly or wrongly, and there were many essays in the book that point out problems not only in the reception of Watchmen or how we read it, but also in the consistency of character and other issues like this. But we're almost in this position in which, because Watchmen has been sort of the Citizen Kane of comics for so long, whether we think that's accurate or justified or not, we put so much weight on it that here we are talking about Zack Snyder and all of this business, and sort of, the echoes of revisionism in the 1990s is, Punisher is massacring people and, all this gratuitous blood and darkness.
While quoting Nietzsche.
Yeah, right.
You killed my family. Do not look too far into the abyss, for this looks also into you. I got my copy of Nietzsche right here.
Well, most vigilantes, in fairness, do have philosophy degrees. I mean, there's nothing like a philosophy degree to prepare you for life on the street.
We need to write a story. We need to write an Elseworlds Punisher tale where Frank Castle's family is murdered. He's like, that's it. I'm going to grad school.
Well, I'm thinking of, all the unemployed people who went into higher education, like, fuck this, man. This is a rat trap. I cannot stand waiting as an adjunct faculty member to find out if I have a job. I'm going to kill me some fucking criminal. Well, I think we just gave Zack Snyder his next independent movie.
Yeah.
Can I say, while we're on the brief subject of Watchmen's influences on other things, can I just toss out how thoroughly flabbergasted I was? I mean, of all like Watchmen's sort of grumpy, goes in all these grumpy directions, and you can certainly draw a straight line from Alan Moore's Watchmen to, you know, grumpy Superman in the movies now. And everybody, grumpy Aquaman. There's a straight line from grumpy Khal Drogo Aquaman to Alan Moore's Watchmen. But boy, I was flabbergasted to see Watchmen show up in, of all places, Frozen. Right? When she makes that palace in Frozen, it's a goofy musical, and she constructs that palace out of ice, and I'm going, oh my god, somebody read Watchmen and was like, we're gonna do this now in Disney's Frozen, and all these little kids are like, she makes the and it's like, it's exactly the scene. I leapt right over there to get my copy of Watchmen, and it was it's such a funny place for that to go. It made me deeply happy.
Right, and that was not a depressing, grumpy movie.
That's right. It's a singing, dancing movie.
Yeah.
So what we need is the all singing, all dancing Watchmen adaptation.
Well, wasn't there a little parody strip called Watchmen Babies?
Yes.
All the characters like as little Peanuts type folks. Yeah. When DC came out a couple of years ago, it was a couple of years ago now, right? That the Before Watchmen stuff came out.
Yeah, I haven't read any of that.
Yeah, I let it pass me by. I was at killing time at a comic shop in a different neighborhood, and they had some in the 3 for $1 bin.
Mm-hmm.
So I picked up a couple, I think, number ones of the different series, and I read through them, and the only thing that it reminded me of are those Jane Austen fans who like write complete backstories for every paragraph. You know, if somebody mentions they went to the fair, you get this novella about what happened when Mr. Darcy was at, you know, the market that day, and it seemed like they were doing that with these Before Watchmen comics, where it was just, let's pad out as much as we can from every slight reference we can dig from the original text and make some money off of it. Did they make money off of it?
Yeah, I think they did, but they were definitely embarrassed about it. I mean, you know, even on the back of some of those trades, they say, you know, the controversial, you know, as opposed to, this is really awesome, guys. You need to find out what was going on with, you know, Rorschach as a kid, if Watchmen didn't tell you enough. So, I mean, I guess in theory they'd made money on it, but it wasn't the sort of, you know, lightning bolt through the industry that I think they had hoped for. But, I mean, you're kind of getting at, you know, Walter, to return to the point of your essay, I mean, Watchmen exists in this kind of context of all of superhero history, right? I mean, not only the Charlton characters, but, you know, going back to sort of the silly days of, you know, the 60s and before that to the 40s, and, you know, the rise of, you know, the sort of social realism of the 70s, quote unquote, and now we're talking about how Watchmen sort of projects itself into the future. So, you know, we can't see something as disparate as Man of Steel and not see the effects of Watchmen. I mean, it's almost as if Watchmen exists in this kind of, you know, historical firmament, and you know, you can't even talk about Watchmen without going in one direction or another, and in this very odd way.
Yeah, I think you're trying to put into words what I was just thinking as we were having this conversation, that Watchmen doesn't exist as a work that can be expanded or continued. It's almost like you know, what does Doctor Who call them? The fixed moments in time. It's one of those things that's just there, and you use it as a lens to look backwards. And a whole other essay I would write is Watchmen's really about how bad social realism was in the 70s. I mean, that's another way you can look through Watchmen at a whole different era. And now, like we can't look at any of those things that it tried to do without seeing that echo in other things that are doing it. And I love the idea that there's a straight line, you know, to grumpy Aquaman, because this is the what is now considered literary comics by a certain slice that can't get away from this effect of Watchmen, that was the important part.
Now, I mean, in fairness, there were other works. I mean, obviously, Dark Knight Returns was prominent. Year One. I mean, there was a lot of stuff coming out at that time. But Watchmen kind of, ironically, because to some degree of its literary qualities of flashing around the time, of these 12 chapters, of the quotations, mixing stuff like Bob Dylan and Nietzsche, this kind of high-low pop culture thing. Because of all of that, Watchmen somehow seemed to rise above and adopt this place. And I'm wondering now if Watchmen's reputation is, if anything, a little on the decline. That it's had maybe not that that balloon has had a pin poked through it, but some air is leaking, maybe.
Well, that's sort of an inevitable consequence of time passing, and there have been people looking back at. Well, there was a big controversy just last year about Alan Moore's view of current comics and current comics scholarship. That Julian, I know you remember this incident very well.
Yeah,
you were sort of involved with that, and. I think there's a generational shift that's taking place now where maybe it's viewed as part of the old establishment way that needs to be knocked over and torn down. I don't know. For some reason, I'm looking back now. I don't know that I've ever felt this way before, but right now I'm almost wishing that Jeff's essay had been more hostile. I wish it had been the essay that I was sort of expecting it to be from his initial, it's not the greatest thing in the universe. Maybe what we really needed was an essay about how crap Watchmen was, and really take the forward position on that.
I gave you the essay that you deserved, that you needed.
I like how half the words you've uttered have been in your Christian Bale Batman.
Christian Bale Batman voice. Revengeance. I use it all the time. It's great. It's the gift.
I thought that was the Rorschach voice.
It's the same. It's all the same. It's all the same voice.
There does need to be a podcast or something about the new default voice of superhero.
Yeah.
The voice
somebody should do a podcast that's just Rorschach and Christian Bale Batman having conversations.
Well, and you've got Arrow, who talks to most people,
That's
which
true.
on the TV show he's got the little voice doohickey. I just started watching that, so I'm very behind. But the superhero voice, it cracks me up. It just makes me laugh every time.
Yeah, and this goes along with some problematic social depictions, and I think that one of the things, Richard, that you were talking about is sort of tearing down the old establishment. That's part and parcel of sort of a changing of the generations and changing views. But I think that also we're so much more conscious now, even than 2 years ago, than 4 years ago, of social issues. Of issues of women's rights and transgender issues and minority rights and a lot of these revisionist works. I mean, Dark Knight, of course, Miller's kind of publicly gone far right, and we look back and see Dark Right as a lot more fascistic than I mean, some people were saying at the time, but that the general public did, and I think that we look back and. Certainly Alan Moore wants us to not like Rorschach, but there's a lot of the sort of grumpy urban stuff in Watchmen that does not hold up necessarily as well. Certainly the portrayal of women.
Well, okay, I'm glad you mentioned that because that's exactly where I was headed next, because I remember that very first day that we talked about this book, you actually mentioned a potential essay topic that I thought was brilliant, and it needed the exact right person to write it, and we never found that right person. And I was afraid, I I did not want this to be done by anyone less than the ideal author, who never emerged. But there needed to be a serious examination, and I'm not saying an attack, I'm not saying tearing down. There needed to be some serious critical examination of Silk Spectre.
Yeah.
Specifically, the elder Silk Spectre, Sally Jupiter.
Yeah, I remember that conversation.
Her story, her arc with the comedian, it deserves looking at, and it's probably never gotten the looking at it deserves. And my biggest disappointment, in retrospect, my biggest regret about the book, is that I didn't cast a wide enough net. I didn't know where to look. And now, especially over the past couple of years, with the rise of bloggers who are much more articulate, knowledgeable about feminism, and, as you say, social justice issues, there are so many more people now I could turn to, and I could have found someone who would do that job. And so I still regret that that's not in the book.
Maybe there's some kind of a way to do minutes before minutes. The controversial returning to the origins.
Well, you're not the first person to suggest that. Julian and I actually talked about whether or not there was something in it, and I remember I said, yeah, we could easily fill a whole second book with stuff we had to leave out of the first one that we never got around to.
What would be interesting to me in following it up, whether it's a second book or just in our minds here, you know, the kind of thread that you were talking about, Richard, and Jeff may have the same experience here. The perception of the people that I was talking about before, the younger people like my students, of the presentation of those kinds of tropes of women like Sally Jupiter, which is something that we can relate a lot of characters from movies or literature to when we're examining, you know, her agency and her arc. They just don't have those touchstones, because the culture that they're living in doesn't represent those to them. And there's a real gap of understanding with what someone's trying to do creatively when they present a character like that. It's almost the presumption that my students have a hard time distinguishing, for example, commentary on feminism or commentary on racism from racism or sexism.
Yeah, my students have the same problem too. Every semester I get questions, and students come to me and they say, Professor, listen, I wanted to get your opinion. You know, as a Christian, you know, how do you navigate this and that? And I say, I'm not Christian. And they go, and I say, why do you think that I'm? They're like, you're always talking about Jesus and God and God's plan, and I'm like, I'm teaching Paradise Lost.
Yeah, so when they see a character that's designed to represent some kind of attitude, they don't say, oh, the author is making a comment on how people felt about certain people. They're saying, why is he being mean? And they don't understand the, kind of the complexity of it. So unpacking some of that would be really useful, whether it shows up on a blog or in another book or someplace like that. And then I could use it in class, and I could get through to some of these.
Well, see, that right there would be a powerful argument for doing book 2.
Well, as long as Before Watchmen isn't, 48 chapters all produced by various people having little connection to each other. Yeah, I mean, I remember having that conversation, Richard, and I remember, since then there's been more talk about the trope of sort of falling in love with your rapist, which happens in Watchmen. And I remember us having that conversation and sort of at the time saying, boy, nobody's talked about this. And it's right there on the page. And, I remember saying, in full disclosure, it works for me from a character angle, but it's there and nobody's talking about it, and it deserves somebody to look at. And fortunately, in the last few years, there have been those discussions. Maybe not as much as there should have been, and should have been all along, frankly, because, of course, one of the things that is very apparent is that women were always a part of comics, and were simply silenced. And these questions weren't asked, and when women did ask them, they were not published in the fanzines and were not given a central place in the comic shop discussion.
Well, I slightly disagree with that.
Okay.
From my perspective, in having entered comics fandom in the early 70s, mid-70s, I have always known women who are active in comics fandom and who are writing for fanzines, publishing fanzines. They were part of the discussion. And what happens, though, is the history gets eroded and erased. The whole history of comics fandom was never adequately recorded or represented today. The narrative that comics were an unwelcoming place for female readers, it's one of those things where it sort of sounds to the modern day audience, that sounds like that must be right. It was a more sexist time back then. The truth is, if you actually go back through, say, Silver Age comics, for example, I'm just picking an example at random because we have some data here. If you go back through and look at the Silver Age Marvel and DC comics, look at the letters pages. And for a lot of those comics, particularly I'm thinking of Mort Weisinger's Superman comics in the Silver Age, and Stan Lee's letter columns, you'd often get half the letters would be from women or girls, female readers. They were always part of that scene, but the atmosphere in comic shops and conventions was never quite as welcoming, so they didn't often, there wasn't as big a turnout at a convention. Conventions were much more male-dominated spaces than they are now. Women were always part of fandom. Now, I have, my perspective on this was partly shaped by the fact that I was a huge, huge fan of the Legion of Superheroes, and part of its organized fandom, the same environment that Tom and Mary Bierbaum and Mark Waid and Paul Levitz all came out of. And that fandom was 50% female, always, from the start. That's a book that had strong female characters, diverse membership, so it had that audience. Trying desperately to bring this back to Watchmen.
But I mean, you know, what is
and the silhouette. So there isn't as much diversity of female viewpoint or female representation in it. So I don't know that there's a huge female fandom who would see themselves represented in Watchmen when you have that limited thing. But really, look at the comics that have female characters with agency represented, and the fans have always been there. The female fans have always been there. So that's a whole other angle on Watchmen that I wish I could have examined. We could have had examined in this book. Boy, this book is really starting to look like crap now. Can we go back and read it? I'm sorry, you guys can stay, but really, I got to go back and do that job properly.
Before we run out of time, one of the things I wanted to do in this was to give a shout out to Richard and tell this little story, because I use it in class when I'm talking about writing, and many people may not know just how much an editor does. He didn't just send out emails and collect a bunch of stuff and staple it together. When I sent him my first draft, Richard sent me back some nice notes, which basically summed up were like, this is great. Can you just make the beginning the end and the end the beginning and rewrite it completely? And he was absolutely right. You know, I had been going in a funnel this way, and it made a lot more sense to go in a funnel that way, however you want to visualize it. And I just revised the whole thing, and it was work, but, you know, that's what we do when we're writing, right? So I really appreciated the input that he gave me on that, and it's a great learning story for my students about what revision is. It's not this was bad. It's people working together to make the best possible product you can. and I was really happy to participate in this project with Richard as the editor, and I think we did put out some good project. It wasn't crap. It was good. We'll do another one that's better.
I'm actually kind of choked up. I am. Oh.
That's all true. It's all true, man.
Well, I thought that the most.
I want to second that. I mean, and just say publicly that you know, you did a lot of work on my book, Improving the Foundations, and editing that as well. And I've seen a lot of manuscripts cross my desk as a publisher in various forms of completion, and I don't think anybody submits anything as not only as polished, but with a kind of clarity that every chapter has been thought out. Every decision in this book, you know, Richard Bensam has thought about and can explain in detail precisely why this essay is in this place, precisely why it has this chapter title and not that, precisely why it starts this way. Every decision was like that, and that was really amazing to see.
Oh, God. Well,
We love you.
fortunately, I have your PayPal account, so I can compensate for that. No, I would say no. Really, honestly, what I saw my primary role on the book as was being the top cheerleader, because I picked people that I knew were great and could do the work, and I also knew how challenging keeping up enthusiasm and energy was, and how much people needed that. So anything I did right was just the result of my own bad experiences with other editors, and my determination not to duplicate the bad experiences I'd had, and to try to imitate the good things. I remember sending out a message to all the contributors when we closed the book that I just thought the best part of this was I got to read the whole thing before anyone else. And I am not making that up. I'm not kidding. That was the biggest thrill for me. It was like, oh my God, there's this awesome book. My name is on it. Sure, that's cool too. That wasn't even the biggest deal for me. It was that I got to read this book first. And so that part of it was great. But I'm overcome with self-consciousness and emotion right now at all these kind words.
Well, you did a fantastic job, and now we just have to convince you to do Minutes to Midnight too.
2 more minutes to midnight.
We found more! There's more Minutes to Midnight! We thought there were 12 minutes to midnight. It's actually half an hour.
Well, no, not if it means I have to read before Watchmen. Sorry, that's not happening.
Okay, well, it's about that time. I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank our Patreon donors who make this possible.
Is anyone watching this? That's awesome.
Yeah, we had some people come in, and now some people left, but we've still got some. You know, the Patreon donors, you know, every dollar counts, and it really means the world to us. And I want to thank Richard and Walter and Jeff. Jeff, I want to plug. You have a book that just came out from Sequart. It's not on Watchmen. It's on Matt Fraction's Casanova, the future of men, the future of comics.
Yes. Oh, I'm saying something now so that the computer will put me first. So now I'm on the big screen now. Okay, there, I said it.
And that just came out a couple months ago. So
it did.
Well, you know, that's one of the great things about these anthologies is that we get to meet each other, whether in person or online, and we establish these relationships and hopefully keep those going. So thank you all so much for participating, and thank you for watching.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.